Welcome to Tufts University. This is a beautiful weekend, so thank you for visiting. I hope you get also time to walk around campus a little bit. If you're taking classes, or if your students are taking classes in economics or math or computer science, make sure to check out our new building, the Joyce Cummings Center, which is the short walk along Boston Ave, right at the corner of College and Boston Ave. So that's where we're now teaching. And that's where our offices are, and your students are spending a lot of time there, which is wonderful. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sort of glimpse into one of the classes that I teach here at Tufts, some of the topics that we talk about. The class is called Economics of Management and Strategy. We cover three broad areas. The first area is should companies be big or small? What do economists have to say about it? What factors are sort of favoring being big, and when is it good to be small and nimble? We talk about what's called competitive strategy for companies. That means what types of products should they develop? Should they be sort of high quality but higher cost versus lower quality, lower cost? When would you decide to do one or the other? And what happens when you have a new product that you're introducing into the market? And then the third area is on employee incentives. How can companies, managers motivate their employees? And that's where I'm going to spend a little bit of time today. In terms of learning methods, and I have a picture here from the campus that we have in Talloires, France, where I got to teach this summer. So in terms of learning methods that we use in this class, and more generally when we get to the economics curriculum, we sort of blend a mix of theory, that's really logical thinking, statistical evidence, so we place a lot of emphasis on data, using data, how would you test hypotheses with data sets. We talk about experimental evidence. We have a lab on campus as well, where faculty and sometimes students run experiments in the lab, testing economic situations. And then the other thing we do in this class is that we use case studies from the real economy, from real companies, to understand the situations that they were facing and how it sort of matches what we are doing in the classroom. So it's a blend of all these things that's really giving the students a foundation in economic thinking, and also the tools to apply what they learn here at Tufts in their lives, in their work lives, once they leave here, so that they have skills that stay with them. I'm very fortunate to be teaching a topic that has a textbook on the topic from three economics professors. This is one of the leading textbooks on this topic, and I have the pictures here of Professors Pitfalls, Richards, and Norman, who wrote that textbook together. It's now in its fifth edition. So we use some of that textbook, but we also use a lot of other sources. Okay. So one of the topic I want to talk to you about today is how companies can use incentives to motivate employees. And so the first thing we do when we talk about this topic is we actually read a chapter from this bestseller, Freakonomics. It's been out for a few years. Some of you might have read it. If you haven't, it's a really fun read. And we read the chapter that tells us a lot about how we need to think about incentives. And in particular, there's sometimes this notion that incentives are only about money, especially in an economics class. That's all just about money. But what's very important to recognize is that human beings make decisions not just based on money, but also based on their social pressures or social environment that they're facing, based on their peers, what their peers expect from them, and also based on their moral beliefs. So what they think is right, what should be done. And so that when we think about incentives, we have to look at the interplay between the financial incentives, the social incentives, and also the moral incentives, and really combining those three to understand how people would behave. So that's where we start. But then to drill a little bit deeper for today, I'm going to tell you more about what we learn about financial incentives and the use of financial incentives in companies. while going through this class. So what are financial incentives in companies? That usually means that you pay people more based on some performance metric that you give them. So, this sort of started in the Industrial Revolution, where a piece rate pay was introduced. So the more pieces somebody finished, the more they were paid. We have this today. So I have a picture here from agriculture, where you can also often employees get piece rate pay, so paid based on the amount that they harvest, for example. And we have this in the modern economy. For example, sales people are often paid commissions, and many employees in large companies receive either stocks or options, with the idea that if the company does better, then everybody receives more money at the end, right? So those are examples of financial incentives. So benefit, you reward employees for the work that they do, and so they work more, they get paid more, and so that's why you hope that they will then actually work harder if you give them, if you pay them based on the output, the amount of work that they do. Okay. So that's where we start. That's sort of the starting point for us, but then we go into other things that we need to consider. So, the modern economy is not the same as the economy was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So what are other things that we need to keep in mind when companies use these financial incentives? And that's very common for economics, that we're sort of saying, yeah, there are trade-offs if you introduce some new metric. You have to look at all the side effects. What else is going to happen here? So I said we use case studies in class. One of the case studies that we talk about is based on the company Safelite. This is a company that installs new windshields if your windshield is broken. And they have a whole fleet of installers who nowadays will come to you if your windshield is broken and replace it for you at the place where your vehicle is located. You don't have to come to them. So their type of work for the installers, what they need to do is they need to be able to install windshields, but there's also driving involved and picking up parts and arriving at the right location. And so the case study that we look at focuses on the point in time where Safelite changed the way it was paying these installers, these windshield installers. They used to all be paid based on the hours that they put in. Right? You work for 8 hours, you get paid a fixed amount, but that didn't depend on how many windshields they actually installed. And they, at the time, installed about 2.5 windshields per day on average. When the management estimated it would take about 30 minutes per windshield, right? So yeah, there's driving involved, but there was sort of this potential that they weren't working that hard. So the company said, we're going to change things. We're going to pay you based on how many windshields you install. Okay, what happened? Well, they worked harder, right? They increased their productivity. They installed more windshields per day, right? And so overall, a lot of employees actually were able to earn more than before because they were now being paid on their performance. They did better overall, and the company did better overall, right? So that was great for all of them. There were some employees who quit. There were employees who were worried that they couldn't keep up with the performance that was expected from them, or were just worried about this sort of uncertain pay. Maybe there were going to be days where they didn't have the chance to install a lot of windshields. So there was turnover. That's sort of our economics word for employees are leaving and new ones need to be hired. And so the types of people who chose to work at the company were a little bit different. Those were the people who said, yeah, I want to work at a company where if I work harder, I'm going to get paid more. Right? So those are two things that happen. The one that you obviously would have expected, they get paid for their output, they work harder. But the other thing is also that the mix of employees changes. Right? So that's one of the lessons that we learn here, that different pay practices also attract different kinds of workers or employees. Okay? So that's sort of our first insight from this case. And then we recognize that performance pay was really good for this company and has been really good for many companies. But we do want to sort of think about some of the pitfalls that come with it. And so then we spend some time talking about sort of these potential pitfalls that can arise. One of those is that there might be factors beyond the employee's control that kept them from working hard or kept them from installing a lot of windshields. Right? In this particular case, it turns out that the dispatchers would sometimes give the wrong directions to the driver. The driver would show up where the dispatcher said they should go, and that was the wrong place. Right? That's not the installer's fault, that's the dispatcher's fault. So are you going to punish the installer for that? Hopefully not. That's one thing to recognize. Sometimes the installers were given the wrong part, the wrong windshield, and they got to the vehicle that they were called to, and the windshield didn't fit. Again, not their fault. There are issues that are related to team production, and then there are also issues that are related to what we call gaming or distortions. So we're going to look at some of those. All right? So factors beyond the employee's control. I mentioned some of them, the wrong parts, the wrong directions. If you're from here and if you come back in December, maybe at the end of the semester to pick up your students here, that's what it might look like here in Boston when there's a snowstorm. We don't drive. And so there won't be any windshields that are broken or unless the branch falls onto your car. And so there's a lot less work for installers on those days, right? So bad weather means people just stay home. Those are factors just beyond the entire company's control. Now, if a company were not to recognize that performance, or the number of windshields that an installer can install per day, that also depends on factors beyond the employee's control. So companies that don't recognize that will have employees that lose motivation, right? Because they say, well, it wasn't my fault that I couldn't install this. Somebody else made a mistake, or there's just no demand. Nobody wanted to have windshields today. So it's important to then adjust pay for those factors as much as possible. So for example, have some sort of base pay, or not deduct any pay if somebody else made a mistake. Okay, so that's one thing we talk about. Then we spend some time talking about team production. Right? Again, using this example, the installers depend on others to do their jobs. Many of us in the modern economy depend on others to do their job. And so if something goes wrong, there's often this blame game of, who made the mistake? Whose fault was it? It wasn't my fault, of course not. And for management, it can be hard to tell whose fault it was, right? Because everyone's going to say, no, not me, not me, not me. What's the solution? Are they going to pay everyone less? So a lot of work needs to go into team building. And sometimes it makes sense to pay the teams as a whole a bonus based on their performance. Okay? So that is often the best solution here. If the team as a whole is paid, it's important that that team works well together. Right? But if the team works well together, then things like peer encouragement or peer pressure can help with individual team members saying, no, you should really fix this, or yes, it was your fault. So change the way you are doing things. And by the way, in the case of Safelite, where they had these issues with the warehouse sometimes giving the wrong parts, or the dispatchers sending the wrong directions, the company worked hard to make sure that those mistakes didn't happen anymore. Right? That really was messing up a lot of things. And so having that performance pay allowed them to identify what was going wrong. Whereas before, everybody was paid, regardless of whether things worked or not. So it was actually much harder for management to kind of tell where the problems were. All right. So team production is an important factor here. And I'm going to spend the last few minutes here on gaming or distortions. So when incentives are given, often sort of, you get what you paid for. And it can be hard to give incentives really well in the modern economy, because in the modern economy it's often hard to observe how well we work, right? So in my case, the way that my superiors try to observe how well I work in my teaching, for example, is that my students evaluate me at the end of the semester, right? And that's great, but there can be issues with that as well. My supervisors look at how much research I produce, right? But in research in particular, often you work really hard on a problem and there's no result. And that's sort of the nature of research, right? We say, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, right? We need to find new things. Yeah. In those cases, it can be hard to tell if somebody worked as hard as they should, and you want to reward them for the effort that they put in, or the outcome, right? My students sometimes come and say, but I studied so hard for the test, why did I not get a good grade, right? Should I reward them for the effort? Should I reward them for what they did on the test, right? And in practice, we use a little bit of both. So for example, we reward effort in class participation. In the Safelite case, what we learned, or what the company learned, was that after they started paying installers for the number of windshields that were installed per day, the number of windshields installed per day increased, but the quality went down, right? Because the installers would work really fast and not necessarily check their work, right? So the company paid for quantity, but not for quality. What they learned very quickly is that they had to find ways to make sure quality was still good. So they tried a few different things. In the end, they said, installer, if you install something that doesn't work, if the windshield's leaking or if something else doesn't fit, you have to go back and fix it, and you don't get paid for that time. Right? So that's how this company responded. That works well if one can tell whether the quality is good or bad, right? Here, the customer can say, yeah, that's not a good job with this windshield installation. They can go and complain. It's not good for the company, but at least someone knows that there's bad quality. Right? In other areas, like healthcare, sometimes no one knows whether the quality is good or bad. Right? That's a much, much harder problem. Okay. So then we spent some time looking at a number of sort of large studies that were done with both team incentives and then also with this gaming or distortion. So one of the studies we look at comes from steel mini mills in the United States. There's a picture of that here. So a bunch of steel mini mills introduced incentive pay for teams. So they said, teams are important in our company. We want to make sure that the teams work together well, and so we're going to pay teams as a whole, not individually. Right? So we're not giving individual financial bonuses, but we give bonuses to a team if the team works well together. They found that some teams did better after these incentives were introduced. For other teams, there was no difference. And the teams that did better were teams that were doing complex tasks where they really had to work together well. The other teams that were doing more simple tasks it wasn't that important that the team members worked together well, and so there we didn't see a change afterwards. But for teams that were doing complex tasks, the team incentives really improved their productivity. So they were doing more with the same amount of time before. Okay. All right. So I said gaming can be an issue. Then there are quite a few studies looking at sort of manipulating incentives. So employees were given incentives to do something, and then the employees sort of meet that incentive, but in a way that's not necessarily great for the company. So first study comes from software sales, and that's pretty common in the sales setting, is that salespeople will receive a bonus if they meet their targets, but the bonus sort of depends on hitting the target, and then if you go beyond the target, there's not an extra bonus to be achieved. Right? That's a pretty common feature. And so what happened for the software company was that that salespeople who were really close to meeting their bonus targets but weren't quite there yet, and it was getting to the end of the quarter and they were going to be evaluated against their target, those people started calling up their customers and said, I'm going to give you a price discount. Please buy from me right now. I'm going to give you a discount. And so they were able to hit their targets because more customers said, sure, you're giving me a discount. I'm going to buy right now. Salespeople hit their targets, but the price cuts hurt the company's bottom line. Right? So that was clearly happening only in the cases where salespeople were really close to the target just before the end of the quarter. It didn't happen to people that had already reached their target, that were far away from reaching their target, or at the beginning of the quarter where it didn't matter. You have to be careful here in Boston. I've heard that some of the police departments in Massachusetts have targets for giving speeding tickets. At least that's the rumor. So at the end of the month, everyone slows down a little bit when they're driving on the roads. Otherwise, they drive way too fast. So keep that in mind when you're visiting. Now, I promised to talk a bit about multitasking. I learned about multitasking from Bengt Holmström, who's a professor at MIT and won the Nobel Prize in 2016 for this work. His work is theoretical, and that's an example of where we sort of blend theory and case studies and large-scale statistical work. So he did a lot of things, but one of the pieces he wrote showed us how sometimes weak incentives can be better in multitasking environments, so in environments where people do many things. And you can take a simple example of where people just have to do two things. He took the example of school teachers, primary school teachers, who have to teach children how to do math and reading and writing, but they should also help them think about complex thinking, analytical thinking. And what's important in these two tasks is that some of them are really easy to measure. Right? You can give a third grader a test and you can see if they can add, or if they can maybe multiply, if they can read and write. But this sort of higher level thinking is really hard to test in a third grader. Right? Or artistic expression is much harder to test in a third grader. That's just one example. There are a lot of examples like this where employees have to do a lot of things. Some of them are easy to measure, others are hard to measure. And usually the sort of things that require more cognitive skills and are more complex are harder to measure. The problem now is if you're giving really strong incentives, then employees are going to go for meeting these incentives. So for example, if you give school teachers really strong incentives on teaching their third graders how to add and read, and those are important things, right? These are really important things. But if that's the only thing that you're giving strong incentives on, and there are no incentives for teaching anything else, then naturally the teachers will really focus on the math and on the reading, right? And to some extent that might be what we want, but at higher levels, we might want them to learn more broadly. So there's a worry that there's teaching to the test instead of broad exposure to many topics. And more broadly, beyond the school setting, this is an issue in a lot of the economy. So one example was when the US first introduced the so-called No Child Left Behind law that was introducing standardized testing into schools and making public schools accountable for how well their students did in standardized tests. What we saw was that the students who were sort of near the threshold for passing, here that's sort of in the middle of this graph, those students saw a lot of improvement. The students that were far away from passing, and the students that were already well beyond the threshold for passing, those students saw much less improvement. So this could be because the teachers were suddenly paying a lot of attention to only a subset of their students, those that they could bring across the threshold for passing. Right? So that's one thing we need to worry about when we introduce these incentives. Just quickly, a few other examples. This is from hospitals in New York and Pennsylvania, where report cards were introduced, rating these hospitals on how well they did with cardiac surgery, for example. And the hospitals responded by accepting fewer high-risk patients, right? Because they would now be penalized for accepting patients who were more at risk of bad outcomes. And spending increased and health outcomes were worse. There's another study looking at this in nursing homes, where nursing homes are rated on certain aspects of what they do, but not other aspects. So what did nursing homes do? They shifted their effort towards what was being measured, away from what was not being measured. Right? Overall, no more effort, but worse outcomes on the things that were not measured. And then this is some work that I've done looking at airlines, where several airlines, they didn't want to have so many delays, and they started paying their employees bonuses for arriving on time. And by the way, this is a government definition of what does it mean to arrive on time if you're flying on an airplane. It means you're 14 minutes late or less, okay? But that does not apply to my classroom, okay? So don't come 14 minutes late to my classroom, please. So when employees at these airlines were paid more for arriving, no more than 14 minutes late, what we saw was that there are a lot of flights that arrived 14 minutes late. Here's a graph. So this is the arrival delay before the incentive, and this is 14 minutes, and you see, sort of a pretty smooth distribution. This is after. 14, 50. Okay. Good. So I hope you had fun, and I had fun. We do learn that incentive pay is a good thing. It can increase productivity. But should be applied with care, and we want to think about sort of the complexities of introducing it. So what does it do to employee turnover, quitting? What happens with team incentives? What happens with multitasking? And what happens with gaming? So I'm out of time. Thank you for visiting, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
If anyone has one or two questions, we do have about 5 minutes, so I'll run over there.
Thank you so much for that interesting talk. I'm just curious, I have no background in economics, but I'm just curious if there's any difference in this for nonprofit or healthcare where there is a mission-based work, and how do physicians or healthcare teams where their incentives are patient satisfaction, not just productivity, cardiac surgery metrics, how does that play into this? How does it change?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So just the question is about whether these incentives, in particular in healthcare, are different for nonprofit hospitals or organizations. And yes, there is some difference. It doesn't go away completely, unfortunately, right? So the benefit of having nonprofit entities is that they can focus on other aspects besides just money making. But unfortunately, we see that, we could say, fortunately, the incentive is less strong in those cases, but it doesn't go away completely. So those hospitals, for example, also rely on these public ratings, publicly available ratings for patients to choose to come there. And if their statistics show high mortality after heart surgery, patients will avoid them. So they're not immune from that, even though it might be less strong. Yeah, but thanks for the question. There's one, okay. Okay.
Thank you. I was curious to know whether you think that the same thing that happened with the airlines happens with schools like Tufts that get rated, and how it affects everything.
Yes, thank you.
I never heard of some of these ratings when I applied, and it didn't seem to matter, but now it's all everyone talks about.
Yes, thank you for that question. There's actually a colleague at Harvard who's done quite a bit of work on that. And what you need to know about the ratings, and should sort of be good for all of us, or maybe good for our mental health, is these ratings change all the time, and the weights that are given to certain factors change every year. Schools don't necessarily know that in advance, but schools know the kinds of things that we are rated on, right? And so I would always take ratings with a grain of salt. That when we're rated at 27 or 28, I think that's in the broad category. It means we're high quality. But I wouldn't lose sleep over sending your kid to a school that's like 28 versus 24. I think it's really much more important for quality to look at fit with your student, but also what you actually get out of the teaching, what you get out of the classroom, out of the environment on campus, and that these ratings are highly imperfect. Right? I think broadly they can give information about the schools in the top 20 or top 50, that kind of thing, but they're not precise, I would say. Thank you. Okay. There was a question right here.
One more
quickly.
question.
Good.
So this topic is huge in my industry that I work in, and it seems I've been in my industry for 25 years, and it seems like we can never figure it out. We keep going around in circles. We change our incentive system every year, because one year we reach optimal goal here, but then we want to shift people's attention over there, so we change it to over there, and then so is there an example of where this has been solved really well, or is that just the nature of it? I mean,
I'm very sorry that I have to say no to that. So what we know is that when there are a lot of dimensions that the employee should work on, is that sometimes it's better to back off on the sort of incentive on individual tasks and just sort of give a global incentive. So maybe the company overall is doing well, rather than incentivizing on individual things. But that in environments where effort or how hard someone works is hard to measure, it's just a tricky environment to work in, and there's, Bengt Holmström would say, you can't solve the problem there, right? You're just stuck in a difficult place. Yeah. Sorry to end on that.
Thank you very much.